Dr. Valeriano, we're so thankful that you're here with us today to share some insight on the topic of brand name versus generic medication.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just advance the slide. Just a medical disclaimer. So just to stay for this for 1 second. So the idea is basically we're going to give you the story about generics versus brand names. But if you look at bullet 2, this is not a substitute for professional care, meaning I'm not going to try to, this is individualized with you and your healthcare provider, your neurologist. So what I'm going to tell you again is in kind of broad strokes, and some of this may apply to you individually, some may not. But anything that you're going to do based on this, make sure obviously you would talk to your healthcare provider. This is not a substitute for the person, that he or she that takes care of you, just so you're aware of that. So go ahead, next slide. So what we're going to talk about is definition of brand name medicines versus generic medications, about prescribing generic medications, about prescribing brand name medications, tips for talking to your doctor, and then final tips and takeaways. So brand name medication is the original drug that was developed and marketed by the pharmaceutical company, by the drug company. This must be approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA, after demonstrating safety and effectiveness through a series of studies. We'll get to that, I think, in the next slide. This is protected. If you could just go back 1 second, I'm sorry. Yeah, so this is yeah, I think we're 2 slides back. One more. There we go. So this is protected by patents and exclusivities for a certain amount of time. Most cases 5 years. I think in many cases it can be longer, up to 7 years, but can be longer for medications for a disease or continued or conditions that affect fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. Okay. So this is to go over. So when these medications are going to be brought to market, if you look at the far right where it says FDA post-marketing, there's a sort of a long and arduous road to bring these medications to market. And just keep in mind, so what is getting developed and what is getting approved as you go through this is it's a pharmaceutical company's drug, but what's getting approved is actually the molecule. In other words, if this is a medicine like lacosamide, which is the brand name is Vimpat, but so what they're looking at is lacosamide. Eventually, if that gets approved, and the company that UCB is the company, it'll come out as Vimpat, but it doesn't mean that Vimpat's the only thing that works. It just means Vimpat is the brand name lacosamide, but the medication that's being vetted, it's being looked at here, the molecule is really the lacosamide. And we'll sort of tie that in with the area of generic drugs. So in the beginning, there's just discovery and development of the drug. Preclinical research is a lot of times just animal research, where these get to be very long studies and takes a long time to bring the drugs to market, is when the clinical research comes. And these are usually what are called phase 3 studies. So in phase 3 studies, these are clinical, they're randomized controlled trials that usually are double blinded. In other words, the people will volunteer for these studies. Usually we're talking about epilepsy here. So people that get in drug studies usually are people that have difficult to control epilepsy, multiple seizures, even on the medicines they're on. They will get in one of these studies, and usually there's a baseline where they count your seizures on the medicines you're on now. Then the new medicine, the quote experimental medicine and or a placebo is added. And then they compare your seizures over a certain amount of time, usually 12 weeks, versus the 8 weeks that they counted in the beginning for your baseline seizure frequency. It takes many people, many patients to actually show a statistical difference that these medications work. So these are very expensive trials, and they take a long time to get a drug approved. I'm not making an excuse for what brand name drugs cost, but this is where a lot of the cost is. These studies are very expensive to do. They're done usually at multiple sites across the United States, multiple universities, and also sometimes worldwide. So this is, like I said, a long process, takes several years to finally get a drug to market like that. So the drug has to show effectiveness versus placebo. It has to meet a certain statistical level for the FDA. So if you look at sort of the light blue, the 4th bullet over from the left, for the FDA to review it. So the FDA then will approve it based on how efficacious the drug is, how effective the drug is. And then after that, then the FDA also has post-marketing safety monitoring, obviously, where anything that happens to the drug, any kind of side effects, adverse events, that will need to be reported so that you can monitor the safety of the drug. It's hard to give you a number how many people are in the studies for the drug. It'll be usually several thousand people in a study. But then obviously once the drug comes to market, many more thousand people are put on. So there is a monitoring to make sure that once the drug is exposed to multiple people, many more people, that there's nothing untoward that happens. So as you can see on the bottom, it says the process to discover and develop new drugs and bring them to market takes many years and is very costly for the pharmaceutical company. Okay. So there's the drugs are on patent. And usually, like I said, the patent can be 5 years, it can be 7 years, it could be 9 years. It depends on some various conditions, and also if there's different ways the drug can be given, if it's given only orally, if it's given IV, etc. So once the patent exclusivity ends, companies can apply to create a generic medication. So a generic medication is the same as the brand name in dosage form, safety, strength, effectiveness, and intended use. To be approved by the FDA, it must demonstrate bioequivalence. That is, it works the same way and provides the same clinical benefit. Approved generics are safe, effective, and interchangeable with their brand name counterparts. So let me go back to the first sentence here. So now what happens is X amount of time has gone by. You now have the patent on the drug. So the exclusive use of the drug by the original pharmaceutical company has ended, and other companies can now apply for generic medications. Or actually for a generic version of this medication. So if you look for the third bullet, it said to be approved by the FDA, it must demonstrate bioequivalence, that it works the same way and provides the same clinical benefits. So what happens is when the generic medication comes out, or to get it out, they don't have to go back and prove that the drug, that this molecule, let's again, just as an example, we're going to use the drug lacosamide, which the brand name was Vimpat. So now Vimpat actually is the generic. There's generic lacosamide. Excuse me. So now let's say that the patent is run out on Vimpat. So now other drug companies now are applying for generic lacosamide to come out. They don't have to go back and do studies to show that lacosamide works. The idea was that the original studies, because that would really slow up any kind of ability to get generics. They'd have to go through the whole studies again. So they don't have to show that lacosamide is effective in patients, because that's already been shown, or the Vimpat, the drug, the brand name drug, would not have been approved. What they have to demonstrate is bioequivalence, which means that the generic medicine that they give, the generic lacosamide, when people take it, they achieve levels that are very similar, very equal to the medicines when people take the brand name Vimpat. So in other words, the idea is when you take a generic lacosamide, as opposed to taking the brand name Vimpat, the amount of the molecule, the amount of lacosamide in your system needs to be the same between the two, because the efficacy, the drug was proven to work as it got worked up as lacosamide, and then became Vimpat, became the brand name. The new generic is again going to be called lacosamide. So as long as you can show that the generic pill, when it dissolves in your system, will give you the same level of lacosamide in your system as the Vimpat did, that's called bioequivalence. So they don't have to go through studies to prove the drug works. The idea is it's already been proven the drug works, but it was proven that the drug works at certain levels that were attained with the Vimpat, with the brand name. The generics, the burden on the generics is to prove that their generic pills, when taken, allow you to have the same levels in your system of that medication, in this case, let's say lacosamide, as when you use the brand name. So theoretically, if you look at the fourth bullet, so approved generics are safe, effective, and interchangeable with their brand name counterparts. So the idea is it's the same molecule. This is not a different drug. Lacosamide's lacosamide, whether it's called Vimpat as a brand name or whether one of the generic lacosamide, as long as the amount of lacosamide in your system is the same, it should be just as effective regardless of what name is on the pill or what the pill looks like. So I'm going to sort of touch on some of these things as we go along. Let me just see one thing. Just go back one more slide with the slide we were on. So the other thing to remember is the generics are allowed to have a slightly different amount of medication in them than the brand names. The amount of let's say again, we'll use lacosamide. The amount of lacosamide is just a name. There's a generic company in West Virginia close to here, Mylan Labs, that supplies a lot of generics to the Pittsburgh area. So if you use the Mylan Labs generic lacosamide, that may have a slightly different amount of lacosamide. And I'm saying a slightly different amount of lacosamide than the brand name Vimpat has in it. But the same way every Vimpat tablet will have the same amount of lacosamide in it, the generics are the same. In other words, if you use a Mylan Lab generic medication, each Mylan Lab lacosamide generic pill will have the same amount of lacosamide in as the other Mylan pill. So in other words, if you're on a generic and you're controlled with that generic, it's the same as if you're on a brand name and controlled with that. In other words, you're not going to change the dose, the levels are not going to change when you go to the next month's generic if you're still getting Mylan Labs. So there's quality control over the generics, meaning each generic pill has to have the same amount of medicine as all the other generics that company produces. The same way as if you're on Vimpat, if you're on a brand name, the Vimpat has to have exactly the same amount of lacosamide in it, pill to pill. So that's one of the ways we know the generics are safe and effective, because again, it pill to pill in that generic, the amount of medicine will not vary, okay? So how different are generic medications? So the cost can be significantly different. One thing that happens sometimes, so just to read this, tend to cost significantly less than counterparts because they do not have repeat costly studies that require the brand name, and multiple manufacturers create competition. So like I said, the generics don't have to prove that that molecule is effective. That's already been proven by the brand name getting approved. What the generics have to prove is that when you take that pill, you get the same amount of medication in your system as if you took the brand name. One thing I would mention here, just because sometimes it can be a little confusing to patients, is sometimes when a generic first comes out, the price may not come down that much initially. Sometimes there may be only one or two companies that come to market quickly with a generic. So sometimes the cost may not be a huge difference from the brand name initially. But as more companies become involved and more companies manufacture the generic medication, it's like anything with competition, supply and demand, the price will come down. Just to give you an idea, I don't know what the number is right now, but I know at one point with lamotrigine, there were 17 different generics of lamotrigine. Lamictal was the brand name. So once you get that, these prices are going to change. So over a fairly short period of time, there'll be a significant cost savings with the generic versus the brand name. The appearance, the trademark laws prevent the generic from looking identical to the brand name, though the FDA does encourage similar size and shape. So again, this is years ago. I don't know if this was just state, if this was just in Pennsylvania, or if this was national, but in Pennsylvania, and this is not true anymore, when you got a generic medication, you could actually get two different generics in the same prescription. So people would actually sometimes get a bottle of pills that would have two different generics. They would look different. You can't do that anymore. So your generic medication each pill should look the same as the same generic medication. And again, each one of those pills of that generic producer will have exactly the same amount of the parent compound in it as the next one. Ingredients, generic medications may have different inactive ingredients. This happens where there may be how the pill itself is made. So the molecule is going to be the same. The actual the business end, the medicines that's effective is going to be the same. Every once in a while, there may be a different dye. There may be something in the pill that's a little different in the way the pill's made. And so occasionally you see people who this isn't common. Occasionally you see people who may be allergic to the generic medication who were not allergic to the prescription medication. They're not actually allergic to the like I said, let's say lacosamide. They may have some allergic response to something in how the pill's made. In other words, if you want to call it the filler or however the pill is put together, that's very uncommon. You can't be not allergic to lacosamide and you're allergic to generic lacosamide. You can be allergic to other things in the pill, but I don't want to give you the idea that's a common thing. That's very uncommon, okay? So generic, as we just talked about, generic medications have the same active ingredient, safety, quality, and effectiveness. The medications are generally less expensive for both the patient and insurance companies. The numbers, I mean, you can say 80 to 85%. I mean, it may be more than that. It may be a little less than that. Most insurance companies only cover generics when available unless you go through appeals process. So what happens is once generics come out, if a brand name is the only drug available, so a drug like Fycompa, perampanel, let's say, is the generic, but the brand name is Fycompa, there is no generic perampanel. So if you prescribe Fycompa, that's what the people are going to get. But just going back to the example we were using, if you're not on a medicine, a lacosamide, you prescribe Vimpat, which is the brand name, the likelihood is extremely high. The insurance company will not cover that. They will say you have to go to the generic lacosamide, which is much cheaper for them and is actually cheaper for you. So if there is a generic available for the brand name, then almost always the insurance company will mandate that you have to take that. There is an appeals process, and I think as we go on, we can get to that. So next slide. And we'll talk about that here. So there's a narrow therapeutic index for the medications where small differences matter. So patient history, tolerability, allergic reactions, past failure on generic medications. And so let me just talk about this for a minute. So if you're somebody, talk about two different people. So somebody has had trouble getting the seizures under control. You've tried multiple medications. Sometimes small changes in medication may make a difference where your seizures break through. Now you've hit sort of a sweet spot where your seizures are well controlled on a certain regimen that you're on. That includes, especially if this would include a new medication, because the newer medications will be brand names. So that you now want a medication that has a brand name and is working, and now that medication has become generic. In people that, if that's where the appeals process may come in. So if you have somebody where you are difficult to control seizure-wise, it took a lot of fine tuning, a lot of ups and downs to get control. My feeling is if you don't have to rock the boat, don't rock it. So like I just said, even though there's every reason to believe in most people, the generics are going to be fine. And that is true. So I don't want to contradict what I said before, but I'm just saying if it's really something where this is the only thing that's worked for you, and it's possible to stay on the brand name, what's one of the reasons, one of the conditions where you may be really reasonable to try to get the brand name through the appeals process. Where the other side of the coin is this, and I was telling the people and before we joined here, so I have people who years ago, a lot of the physicians, a lot of the neurologists told patients that they should never take a generic, that they have to be on a brand name medicine. So I have people, for instance, I can think of one person who's on the brand name Tegretol on a low dose. I was going to say 600 milligrams a day. Tegretol doses usually go from 600 to 1200. And they've been seizure free now for over 20 years. And so they, said, well, you want to try the generic, because I think for the brand name, they're paying, I don't know, $300 a month for the brand name. The generic would cost them, again, 80% less, but they're afraid to go to the generic because this has, quote, worked for 20 years. It may be that they don't need the medicine at all, but that's a different issue. But the point being, if you're somebody that's extremely well controlled for a long period of time, you're not somebody where a small change may make a difference. I mean, that's somebody where really the likelihood is you can easily go over to a generic. Now, one thing also, there is anxiety in people when they go from a brand name to a generic. Some people accept it better than others. But one thing you can do, and one thing I tell people is, or that we do, so let's say now, sometimes it happens when you change insurance companies. So now you're on X medicine, you're doing good, it's a brand name. Now your new insurance doesn't want to pay for that. So they want you to pay, they want to pay for the generic. So one of the things we can do is we said, look, the brand name works. While you're on this brand name medicine, it has worked, it's been effective. So we're going to get a drug level, a serum drug level on the brand name medicine to see what amount of this medicine, what concentration of this medicine in your system is effective. Then if you have to go to the generic, once you do, after you sort of get a steady state level of the generic in your system, we'll recheck the level. We'll make sure that on the generic medication, your level is the same as it was on the brand name medication. And again, if you remember earlier, you're going back to one of the earlier slides, it's the idea of bioequivalence. As long the medicine itself has been proven what works. So as long as the medicine level is the same on the generic as it is on the brand name, there's no reason it wouldn't be equally effective. So one of the things you can do to allay people's anxieties is to get levels when they're on the brand name, and then after they've made the switch, then you can get levels when they've made the switch to the generic medication to reassure them that they're absorbing the medicine, they're getting the same level. And as long as that level worked when they were on the brand name medicine, there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't work when they're on the generic medication. So that's one thing you can do if the patients are worried about it. And again, I think the more that people are well controlled, and it's kind of, you didn't have to go through 5 or 10 different medicines to get control. There really is almost no reason in general not to go to a generic medication. I mean, again, it's the same medication, it's the same molecule. Here it says insurance requirements, step therapy, try and fail, less expensive generic medications. The other thing that'll happen sometimes in the sort of, again, prior authorization is that because I see a lot of people with refractory seizures, seizures that are difficult to control. So sometimes what can happen is I'll prescribe a new medication that there's no generic, just again, Ficomp, I'll use as an example. So the insurance company will say, no, that's too expensive. But they have to try these other generic medications. Now, sometimes, and this is where your doctor may be helpful to you. So sometimes they'll send a list of, it's not that anything wrong with generic medications, but they'll send a list of medications, some of which are very similar to medications that have not worked. Not because they're generic medications, the medicines did not work. Sometimes with the prior authorization, that's where the doctor may help you and say, look, the brand, it's not that I want a brand name medicine, it's that this medicine's a new medicine. The older medicines haven't worked, and some of the generics we're talking about are very similar, even though they didn't take that particular medicine. It's very similar to medicines that didn't work. And so that's why we want to try the new medicine. In other words, sometimes the doctor can help you get the medicine you want, but in general, as I'm saying, if it's just a question of that you're doing very well, you've done well for years, you're just worried about going to a generic medicine rather than a brand name, and you've been seizure free for 10 years or something like that, the insurance company's usually not going to take that as a reason, and there's probably not a big reason to make that switch. And like I said, if you're worried, you can check the levels of the brand name versus the generic. Okay, next. Okay, so if you have any concerns about your medicine, you should contact your doctor. And the point I was making is this is not substituting for talking to your physician. You really do want to go over with them, he or she, what they want to do and why. And so here's some questions you can ask as the generic. So let's say you have really just always gotten the brand name, it's very expensive. And these drugs, as you know better than I do, the drug prices go up. And so is there now that it's getting more expensive, I just don't want to keep paying this much. Is there a generic available for this medication? Would the physician have any trouble with you going to the generic medicine? Now, sometimes, as I said, there may be reasons to stay on the brand name if you were very difficult to get under control, multiple medicines were tried, small changes sometimes made a difference. But in general, most of the time, the majority of the time, the generic will be absolutely acceptable. So is the brand name drug medically necessary for me or my child? Again, if there's a generic, the answer is probably you don't need the brand name. It probably is not necessary. What side effects should I look for if we switch from the brand name to the generic? One thing I don't tell people by and large is I don't like to sort of outline side effects too much, because it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell people what to watch for, it tends to happen a little more often. Like I said, this is going to be the same medicine. There can be a slight change in the amount of that medicine that's in the pill. It's very minimal, but again, it may be a little bit different. So what I just tell people, and this is true when I use any medicine, whether it's generic, if there's some real big thing about a medicine in the beginning and say, look, this is really something that's a very common side effect, look for this. But otherwise, what I tell people is if something seems different to you, when you switch from, this medicine to that medicine or the brand name to generic, if something does not seem the way you're more tired, whatever, if there's something you think has happened that you don't like when you've made this switch, then let me know. The other reason I do that is because sometimes if you outline things and say these are the things to watch for, and it's not something you outlined and something else happens, the patient may not think that that's from the medicine. So I keep it open-ended. Just is there something you don't like when you switch from the medicine rather than outline things? And I think that way the patient, if there's anything that's bothering them about the switch, whether it's medicine to medicine or brand name to generic, then they would get a hold of me. Okay? So key takeaways that we spoke about: generic medications are safe and effective. That's absolutely true. Individual medical circumstances may guide the choice of brand versus generic medication. Again, I think we spoke about that. If you have any questions or concerns about your medicine, again, make sure you speak to your physician. And do this, obviously, you're going to do this in conjunction with the physician. And it's important that if you do switch, the same way if you switch a medicine to another medicine, the same brand to generic, it's something you have to be comfortable with. And if you're uncomfortable with it, then you need to bring up to the physician why you're uncomfortable with it, and then hear their point as to whether they think it's a good idea or not.